gives us three characteristics of the tongue. The first characteristic we see in verses 1 through 4, the tongue, if we are not careful, can be unrestrained. Verses 5 through 9, the tongue can also be unruly. And verses 10 through 12, the tongue can be unreliable. Beginning in verse 1, he says, "My brethren, be not many teachers, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body." James says, "Be not many of you teachers," because those who take it upon themselves to speak for God, to stand before others, whether it be one individual or an entire congregation of individuals, and proclaim God's words, they're going to be held accountable for the things that they teach, whether they lead men to Christ or lead them astray. But also as a teacher, your life is held up as an example before those that you teach. And through your actions and the way that you live your life, people either accept or reject your message. And so then those that teach are held to a greater condemnation. In Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12, there the Hebrew writer tells us, "For when you for the time you ought to have been teachers, you have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and have become such as have need of milk, and not of strong meat." So which is it? Should not many of us be teachers, or should we be teachers already? Do these two passages contradict one another? Well, of course they don't, but rather they complement one another. And the Hebrew writer points out that there's a certain level of spiritual maturity that must be attained before one can teach. And these Christians that he is writing to here had not attained that level of maturity, but they should have. And that's what James warns against. Make sure that you know the book and that you know how to live by the book before you begin to teach it. And that's why it's so important for us to study the book if we are going to be approved before God. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. And so only those who are spiritually mature should become teachers. But all of us as Christians have the duty to fulfill the Great Commission. And so we should all be striving to attain to that level where we can be teachers. And in verse 2 he says, "In many things we all offend." Excuse me. In Matthew chapter 12 and verse 36, Matthew chapter 12 and verse 36, our Lord reminds us that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give an account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy words thou shalt be justified, and by thy words thou shalt be condemned. Our tongues can often be unrestrained, can't they? Every idle word, every word that you mutter under your breath, when somebody cuts you off in traffic, when you're using a hammer and nail and you hit the wrong nail, every joke you tell, everything you say to fill the dead space, to avoid an awkward silence when you're with somebody, everything you say to your husband or wife, or to your children, every idle word will be brought into judgment. Think about God having a great file, and a file with all the jokes that you've told, a file with all the exclamations that you have uttered, a file with all the good things that you said, or the bad. It's all going to be there, and you will give an account for it in the day of judgment, which is why it is so important for us to try to keep our tongues restrained. And we all slip up sometimes, don't we? And that's why he says, "But if any man offend not in word, this same man is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body." In 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 27, the Apostle Paul says that I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, after I have taught others, I myself should be a castaway. He says I keep under my body. And the image here that he uses is that of a wrestler. The one you think of, he's got his opponent there on the floor. If we've seen, the WWF, because they're there really fighting. It's not fake, right? And he's got his opponent by the arm, and he's got his foot in the middle of his back, and he's holding him down, and his opponent's struggling and wiggling, trying to get up, but he's got to stay there. He's got to keep him. It's a struggle to hold that man down for the count. A constant battle. And if he ever relents or gives up for just a minute, his opponent will get up and get away from him and turn on him. And so it is with our tongues. We have to keep our tongues restrained. Just as Paul said, we have to keep our body under, bring it into subjection. Verse 3, James uses the analogy of a horse. He says, "Behold, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us. And we turn about their whole body." And you think about the great size of a horse. This beast weighs over 1,000 pounds. Has a lot of power. And yet, by the mouth, we put a bridle in its mouth, and by its tongue, even a small child can control that horse and make it go exactly where he wants it to, make it go forward or backwards or stop or slow down. Simply by controlling its mouth, keeping its tongue restrained. And so it is with our tongue. But that same horse, if it is not restrained, can cause great damage to the rider and to those around him. You see the bucking broncos in the rodeo. They can tear up the rider sometimes, can't they? And yet when they're properly restrained, what great good they can do. They can pull a plow, they can pull a wagon, they can carry somebody from one location to another. They can herd cattle. And so it is with our tongue. Unrestrained can cause great damage, but properly restrained can do a lot of good. And in verse 4, he gives us the analogy of the ship. "Behold also the ships, which though they be so great, and are driven of fierce winds, yet they are turned about with a very small helm, whithersoever the governor is listed." And James here is picturing those great sailing vessels with the big sails, and they're driven by the winds, and the winds make them go. And in a great storm, those winds can make that ship to go off course if they're going in an opposite direction from where the ship wants to go. Or maybe those winds can even drive the ship against the rocks and cause it to crash. And yet the rudder, such a small piece of the ship in comparison, by using that rudder, you can correct, even in the face of those great storm winds, that rudder can keep that ship going where it needs to go. But if the rudder is unrestrained, unmanned, the ship will crash. And so it is with the tongue. It can keep us on course spiritually if we keep it restrained. But unrestrained, our tongue can lead us into spiritual shipwreck.